This is another iRaw podcast.
In the case of animals and non-human life, what you have is those who act on behalf of them, internalize these norms about say for example neutering or even euthanasia being an animal welfare practice, and then go and act harmfully on the very creatures that they are trying to care for. And so that is what it's the internalization of norms that is the core mechanism through which biopower operates.
Welcome back to the Animal Turn, everyone. This is season 3, where we're focusing in on animals and the urban. And in today's episode, we're going to be speaking about the concept of biopolitics. Now, obviously, biopolitics is a massive concept that's used in a variety of different contexts. But today's guest is going to help us to understand how to use this concept in the context of the urban and trying to understand animal relations. Krithika Srinivasan is a senior lecturer at the University of Edinburgh, and her research and teaching interests lie at the intersection of political ecology, post-development politics, animal studies, and nature geographies. Her work draws on research in South Asia to rethink globally established concepts and practices about nature-society relations. Through empirical projects on street dogs and public health, biodiversity conservation, animal agriculture, and non-elite environmentalism, her scholarship focuses on decolonizing and reconfiguring approaches to multi-species justice. Her research and teaching are deeply rooted in long-term field engagement and praxis in India. And in fact, I speak to Krithika while she is in India conducting research. You'll note throughout the episode that there's a fair bit of background noise. It was extremely hot for Krithika during the interview, and closing the window just simply wasn't an option. So we've got a fair bit of birds and children playing in the background. I apologize if this is distracting at all, but you'll see that towards the end of the episode, we realize that having some of these noises in the interview itself might actually be a good thing. It might be a way of us showing and highlighting how messy life is when you start to move away from some of these sterile constructions of what things should sound like and look like. There's actually a fair bit of the interview that I needed to cut because my own dog woke up, started sneezing, started scratching at the door. I had to take him downstairs for a pee, which when you listen to the episode, you'll realize is quite ironic. I ended up chopping that bit because it was a whole bunch of dead noise and me just saying, "Oh, that's a good Linus, we'll go downstairs," and giving him peanut butter. So it was really an interesting conversation. We had a lot to talk about, and kind of these interjections offered by both my dog Linus as well as the birds outside Krithika's window gave us some interesting insights into thinking through kind of the relationships between animals and the urban. Krithika is extremely knowledgeable about animals and urban theory, and her use of biopolitics is enticing and interesting to say the least. So it was extremely fun and exciting to talk to her, and I hope you enjoyed this episode. Hi, Krithika. Welcome to the Animal Turn podcast.
Hi, glad to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Yes, it's. I think it would have been impossible to have done a season on animals in the urban and not have you on as a guest. I think you are probably one of the most prolific writers about animals and the urban. So, what got you interested in animals being in urban spaces?
I've always lived in cities, and right from when I was a newborn, I've lived around animals and with animals. So both animals inside the home and as a part of the family, and animals in the broader environment, in the broader landscape. And because I've always lived in cities, there have been urban animals, and I guess that is perhaps one of the earliest starting points that I can think of. Um, and given that the urban is the space where I am the most likely to directly engage with animals and interact with animals, it has so happened that it has also been a key focus of my academic work, my scholarship.
But a lot of folks live in cities and have animals and see animals around them, but don't start to think about how they interact with animals. What sparked for you this kind of keen interest in the ways in which we interact with animals in the urban space? How did you start to actually see the animals?
So, um, in one word, my grandfather. He raised us. So I was raised primarily by my grandparents, and he in particular was very in a way he was not a man of his times, and I'll give you an anecdote, an incident that happened when I was a child. Two incidents actually which happened not too far away from each other. So one was an incident when my younger brother got really annoyed with me, and mind you, we were kids then, and he threw a stone which hit me on the nose and made me bleed. And then there was another incident where my cousin, again about the same age, would come to visit, got annoyed with one of the family dogs and threw a stone at the dog. Both my brother and my cousin got the exact same, telling off the exact same censure for it. So, so while I wouldn't say that our family was completely egalitarian when it came to human and non-human relationships, we in many ways, right from the beginning, there was this um, understanding assumption that was taken for granted that uh, we that non-human animals were in no way lesser to people or in any ways ethically fundamentally different to people. So obviously those are not words that were used, and we didn't discuss them in terms of ethics or politics or egalitarianism, but that was the underlying ethos, and which then makes you see things when the moment you leave the home and leave the confines of your family or the protection of your family, and you see that the rest of society does not quite engage with non-human life the same way, then that makes you notice things because it suddenly is different to what you were shown at home, or what you were how you were taught to be at home. And I guess that is why that is when you start noticing, that is when you start seeing, as you put it. At least that's how I would explain it.
So you kind of just had a sensitivity to animals from the beginning, that they deserve to be treated well. There's no reason to not. Wait, that was going to be a double negative sentence. I was going to say there's no reason to not throw a stone at a dog, but you were taught that that's maybe something that deserves to be questioned, that it's not just okay to do it, which is great. Have you always, in your academic life, did you always have an interest in animals, or did you start out on a different path?
So my academic work on animals started only with my PhD. I did my undergrad and my master's education in India, and I did them in fields that were completely unconnected to animals and to geography. I did an undergrad education degree in psychology and the master's degree in social work. Now, it was during my master's degree at the Tata Institute of Social Sciences in Bombay, where I started thinking about some of these issues in along more abstract terms. When I say abstract terms, I mean terms such as ethics and justice and politics. Those are the kinds of like issues and uh, concepts that some of my work and a lot of the animal studies work engages with. And that's because I was doing like I said, a master's degree in social work, and the entire it was it's now much bigger. At that point, when I was a student there, the Tata Institute of Social Sciences, or TIS as we call it, was a very small self-contained university. So the campus had about 200 students at any point in time, most of whom stayed on campus, and most of the staff also stayed on campus. And it was not just a place where you went to study. You lived there, and conversations that would start over coffee in the morning would go on till well after midnight. So it was a very different environment which shaped me quite significantly. And the entire it was set up as a social science university, and it was set up as a university that was primarily concerned with social justice issues. And so uh, pretty much all the conversations there that happened, whether it was within the classroom or outside, were on such issues. Now, it was also a campus that was very more than human, though that was not a term that I was aware of back then. It was in a part of the city which, at the time when the campus was constructed, was on the outskirts, but now it's no longer on the outskirts. But it is located very closely to the Baba Atomic Research Center, and so because of that, it was a very green space because there was a lot of forest cover around the Atomic Research Center, uh, as protection from any accidents. So which meant that, so even though it was a small campus, it was very green, though it's less so now with more construction that has happened over the years. There are a whole range of animals on campus, right from snakes to monkeys to all kinds of water birds, dogs, cats, and just so insects. Um, I, I, I cannot list all the animals. Bats, large fruit bats, and despite the fact that it was located right next to a major highway, so there was this like contrast that you could see as well. And because there were so many animals on campus who came into quite close proximity to people, there were a whole range of interactions, everything from warm and fuzzy positive interactions to a whole range of conflict situations as well. And what I found when I was there, because I studied there for 2 years doing my master's, and I stayed on there for a year where I worked, and then I stayed on there for 2 more years when I started a PhD there, which I did not complete while there. What I discovered was that even though there were many people on campus, both staff and students who were very interested in and committed to the animals on campus, when it came to taking a public position on any conflict situation or any issue, or taking a political position, you'd find that they would hesitate to do so. They would hesitate to speak up if there was a problem. They prefer to kind of do it under the radar. And I found that to be really interesting as something that, because these were also people who talked a lot about justice and politics and ethics, but when it came to this alone, there was this overall reticence that one found even among very senior staff members. Then in my was it my second year or my first year? I can't remember. But one of the in one of the core courses that we had to take, the the course organizer had arranged for a representative from Duty Without Cruelty, which was an animal NGO based in Bombay in Maharashtra, to come and give us a talk. And I remember, like right from the moment that person walked in till at the end of the hour, the reaction in the classroom was really, really interesting. So some people sniggering, other people very openly put their heads down and pretended to sleep. A few people walked out. So it was this. Other people were making snarky remarks about the kind of topic that he was talking about, which was he was speaking on animal rights. So that also happened. So over the course of the 2 years that I was there, I even though we did not study anything explicitly related to animals, and even when it came to studying environmental issues, we studied them mostly from a developmental perspective, right? So from the point of view of livelihoods, or from the point of view of environmental degradation affecting people. So that was the focus. But in various ways, I managed to do some of my coursework around animal related themes. So for one course on histories and philosophies of social work, I did my end of term essay on deep ecology, which was something I'd never heard of before, and that was the closest that I could come to at that time on something that was thinking about non-human life differently. And there were a couple of other such examples. And so, and this continued over the other next 2 years as well, when I was there as a staff member and then as a PhD student. This kind of disjuncture between lived realities and academic work or political work, which by the time I came around to starting to do my PhD, I realized that I would like to, given that there was this what I saw as a huge absence in academic scholarship within the social sciences in India on animals, even though animals were there everywhere and quite closely caught up in human society, that I would like to do that. But then, even though in principle the supervisor I had at that point in time was in principle agreeable, when it actually came to the the details of what I was going to do, there was again there were difficulties, there were disagreements about to what extent I could actually take it. Am I going too far, kind of.
What a journey. And I think, I mean, this is just your personal journey, but it brings forward so many of the tensions I think that animal studies in general as a discipline has possibly grappled with. Kind of where does it sit in the political sphere? Why does it often seem to be an outlier when it comes to justice movements in general? Where a variety of emancipatory movements will support one another, even if they've got a different focus, whether it be racism or sexism, or decolonialism. Oftentimes these groups will support one another, yet somehow animal liberation or animal studies will often be an outlier in these conversations. And I think it's changing possibly somewhat now, but still it doesn't seem to be quite integrated. And I think what you're talking about as your own experience kind of resonates with some of that as well. And then even in speaking kind of about just the presence of animals in your space and how ubiquitous they were. I come from South Africa, but from Johannesburg, which was a really big city. And while we had lots of insects and a variety of different animals in our space, I still kind of conceived of the space as being a non-human space. I don't know if I was really challenged in the way of thinking of my city as being a place in which there were a variety of different animals. And maybe they were there. I mean, they were there. I just wasn't seeing them. But then it gets me thinking a bit about kind of what you were saying there about like developments and developmental ideas, that even now in Canada where I am, people have this idea that cities are divorced from animals. There are no animals here. And I think it's this whole idea that these are modern cities, and that if you've got kind of animals walking around, that means that it's not a modern city somehow. It's a developing city. So my experience just didn't work with that because I was from Johannesburg. I was like, what are you talking about? Anyway, I'm rambling now. I just think your personal experience there brought up so many just interesting tensions between developmental of cities, as well as animal studies sitting within broader justice frameworks, which is fascinating. What did you end up focusing on for your PhD? So you were seeing all of these different tensions around you. What did you end up focusing on?
So like I said, I didn't end up after 2 years there. I left that program and I started looking for a PhD abroad, and I ended up at King's College in London, um, working with David Demerit, who I couldn't have asked for a more supportive supervisor, even though he doesn't do animal studies himself. He was very open-minded, and so I ended up focusing on. I had two case studies in my PhD. One was on street dogs. So both of them were issues of controversy. And I guess now that I'm thinking about it in hindsight, it's perhaps my the kinds of experiences that I was telling you about, personal experiences that shaped my choice of case studies, where I went and I started looking for controversies, and there were controversies around street dogs, which I've lived with all my life, in the sense not just street dogs, but controversies about them, around them. And the second case study was controversies around a marine turtle sanctuary and olive ridley turtle conservation in Orissa. And I was keen on having case studies from these two different domains, because by that time, the little bit of reading and thinking that I had started to do on these issues, what I very quickly saw was that there was this dichotomy that was very deeply entrenched in both public discourse and in scholarship, on conservation on the one hand and animal protection on the other hand, even though at the most basic level they're both spheres of action and and discourse that engage with non-human life with non-human animals, if you want to focus on animals. I quite deliberately chose case studies that came from these two different domains of um, more than human action, to see what would happen if I studied together things that are normally kept apart. So that's what, and which is where my PhD work, the final analysis ended up being an examination of the biopolitical logics that you see in spaces of care, whether they be conservation or animal protection. And by biopolitical, I deploy the term in a very specific sense, where I'm talking about how harm and care are intertwined, are entangled in spaces of care. So I know biopolitics is now used very loosely and in 1500 different ways, but I was using it in a very Foucauldian sense to talk about something very specific about this entanglement of harm and care.
I'm happy you've brought us there, because that's, of course, the focus of today's episode is we're going to look at kind of the idea of urban biopolitics. But maybe before we bring the urban into clear focus, as well as how animals are related to that, maybe we can just talk a little bit about biopolitics and the ways you use it. Because, yeah, I think it's a huge concept, and I think sometimes things maybe get lost in terms of two people speaking about the same concept but with very different ideas as to what it means. So let's start there. What is biopolitics? Maybe you can just give us a little bit of a grappling. And I know this is an hour podcast, like wrap up one of the most complex concepts, but just as a way of helping listeners understand, what are we talking about when you hear the concept biopolitics? What are we talking about here?
So I will say a little bit about how I use it in my work, which draws on how the social theorist Foucault talked about it, and which is about the different kinds of power that you see in society, or the different ways in which power operates. So normally, when we say power, we're used to thinking of power as something that is exerted by through the use of brute force, like as vested in the monarch or in the sovereign, where if you don't do this, I will chop your head off. you know that is how we normally think of power. But what Foucault's work on biopower does is to show that that may not be the only way in which power is exercised, but rather it can be exercised through logics of care, where the justifications and narratives that are used to exercise power are not based on force or violence, but rather on ideas of improvement, right? So if I want to, as the sovereign, if I want to build a really strong army, I could either do it through the exercise of sovereign power, where I say, unless through forcible conscription, where I say, unless you become a part of my army, I will throw you in jail or I'll chop your head off. Or I could say, hey, listen, all of you, can you please? It's good for you to participate in these boot camps every day, because you will be fit and strong, and you will it'll be good for your own health. And hey, by the way, it also means that I have an army ready to go at my disposal when I need it and I want to expand my territories. Now, it so happens now, and this is integral to biopower, that all the people that I'm drawing into my fold using that kind of a logic, not all of them might be suited to participating in boot camps every day and jumping up and down 1,500 times. Some of them might just collapse and die. But then but they
I might just collapse and die. I don't think I'd be a good candidate
yeah,
there.
but then you will still do it, and that is where, and I don't have to force you to do it. You just do it on your own. And the other example that I use to think about this concept is the practice of wearing high heels, which very often it's women who do it, and it's something that is inherently physiologically harmful. But then there are these narratives out at play where which suggests that by wearing high heels, not only do you look more attractive, but you also look more powerful, you also feel more confident, and therefore you then end up engaging in a practice, right, where you, after having internalized these norms about how something that might be harmful to you is also good for you, you start to exercise this power on yourself. Uh, you don't need anyone out there to force you to wear heels. You do it by yourself, even though it is harmful.
So biopolitics, we've got a discussion about power happening here, where on the one hand, power could be exercised through making you do something. You will do this by force. I will dominate you and make you do this, possibly even through threats of violence. Whereas on the other hand, and these are not necessarily opposed to one another, you can have kind of both sets of power operating at the same time. You've got kind of power relationships that compel you to abide by what's happening. And sometimes it's not really clear that there's a top down force, right? It's not like there's some one big person, a king or someone saying you must do this, but you find that you conform to societal norms, whether it's wearing high heels or putting on a suit when you go into a meeting, shaking a hand. You find that there are all of these everyday things you do, and you're not too sure why you do them, but it just kind of seems to be part of convention. It is the way it is, I feel. So I guess biopolitics is kind of, or you're starting to question or look at kind of these everyday things that we feel we must do, where no one's actually really telling us to do it. So why are we
Yeah,
even doing
And
this.
not just
Is that
conventions,
kind of correct?
but practices that are actually harmful to you, but you're convinced are good for you because of these conventions. So we're not just talking about any practice, right? We're talking about practices where you're doing yourself harm.
But is it only practices where you're doing yourself harm, or could it also be positive practices? Or is it our understanding of those practices? So it's not really whether it causes us harm or not, but whether or not we understand it as being good for us.
The
Does that
way
make
I
sense?
have used it, and at least how I understand focus work on biopower, is that these are practices that are harmful. But then they also have
Okay.
this veneer of something that's an improving practice of improve. So
Okay.
it's this meshing of harm and care that is what is integral to biopolitical power or biopower.
And how does the bio come into this? So I get that this is political and how power is moving, between relationships and kind of, and then this, yeah, like you said here, it's possibly harmful for you, but you understand it as being good for you. But where does the bio come into all of this? Why bio in
I suppose
biopolitics?
because we are primarily talking about the government of life. We are not really talking about moving rocks and mountains, though there is an argument to be made that a lot of what we do to ecologies and landscapes can also be understood in relation to biopower. But some of the original formulations and thinking on this was about human populations and human societies.
Mhm. So how we can keep our populations growing? I think reproduction is probably a really good place here. Like why do we take birth control and use condoms and do these things? It's the management of life and the extent to which we would like our populations to grow, and who in those populations we would like to grow. So I think we're speaking at really big levels here. That does kind of give a sense of what biopolitics is, um, kind of power relationships and how they navigate it, how they help to determine who gets to live and who gets to die. Okay, so how then does this relate to the urban? Why, when we're talking about biopolitics and the urban, could you maybe give us an example that would make this more accessible if we're talking about biopolitics in the urban?
So biopolitics is not necessarily an urban concept, right? You will it's something that those ideas are I think idea they can be used to understand, examine, analyze power relations everywhere. But some of my work has looked at the government of life in urban regions, and that is so. The work that has used the idea of biopower the most has been in the context of my work with street dogs in cities, and the various practices of both caring for and controlling them. So some of my earliest work with on dogs and not just street dogs, but I was looking at dog control and care across the UK and India, contrasting the two spaces of societies. So the UK that the paper kind of, and I'm giving you this backstory to kind of explain how harm and care can come together. So this paper had its roots in the first animal studies workshop that I attended, and one of the first talks in that workshop was given by a former head of the RSPCA, which is the Royal Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals in the UK. So it's one of the biggest flagship organizations. And he started off by talking about how the UK needs to teach the BRICS countries, so Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, on how to do animal welfare because the UK was the world leader in animal welfare. And I was sitting there in the audience and kind of seething because I was remembering when I lived in India, I used to do some work in animal sanctuaries and shelters, and especially around street dogs. And I would remember every time a donor from abroad came to visit, especially a major donor, we would go around hiding all those animals that we thought that they would want euthanized because
Really?
yeah, because they had different ideas of what was a good life, and these were animals that we knew with some care would stand a good chance at a happy, fulfilling life. But to some of those donors, they just wouldn't look safe.
It didn't work with their idea of where dogs belong in a city.
Not just where dogs belong, but like how dog what a good dog life is like. right? So it's not just about belonging; it's also about what is a good dog life. So and that's where that's what that whole paper does, is to ask, because you have across the world this fairly entrenched concept. Even though on the one hand, countries, societies across the world have free living dogs, on the other hand, you have the increasing pervasiveness of the idea that dogs have good lives only if they are in human homes, if they are in human property of some kind or the other, if they are under some kind of human care, which is something that that paper unpacks, and and showing that, like, if you're a dog in the UK, you have very few possibilities for life, because if you're not under some kind of human ownership, you have to be dead. Whereas in many other societies, including India, there are multiple possibilities of life for a dog. Now, as a street dog, you obviously you have to go look for your food. You might get run over by cars. You might fall sick and not have any medical care available for you. People might throw stones at you. Occasionally, you might get rounded up and killed. But on the other hand, you also enjoy a great deal of freedoms that pet dogs don't have. So, for one example, you can pee and poop whenever you want, and you're not dependent on somebody coming to let you out. And even if the most conscientious person, I'm sure, is not going to be taking their dog out every half an hour. Uh,
Yeah.
so that's
Yeah, just the ability to decide where you want to go on a walk and when you want to go on a walk. Yeah, it's a very different way to be, I guess. Who gets to decide your mobility, yourself or someone else?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so then I started to dig around and think a little more carefully about why is it that these very contrasting ideas of what constitutes a good dog life came up. And what the paper argues is that ideas of a good dog life can also be quite closely interconnected with various kinds of human interests in and of themselves. So for instance, in the UK, the fact that there are no street dogs now, no free living dogs right now, is directly linked to concerns around rabies in the late 1800s, when all free living dogs were rounded up and killed. And because the UK is an island, they were able to do that pretty successfully, and so it doesn't have porous borders. Um, and that's why you don't have free living dogs now. Even now, any dog that doesn't have an owner is subject to potential death, even though it's called euthanasia. To what extent it meets the criteria for euthanasia is up for is debate. But then somehow over time, what has happened is that it's moved from being a practice of animal control, euthanasia in the context of places like the UK and many other regions, to an animal welfare practice. So oh, this is a stray dog, and if this stray dog, if he or she, if you're not able to find him or her a home, there is no other choice but for him or her to be euthanized, right? And it becomes animal welfare.
Yeah. So if they can't, so in essence, you either are in a home, uh, which is viewed as being good for you. You're a dog and you're in a home and you'll be well cared for. But if you're not in a human home, then you can't live a good life. So the only option is to kill you.
Exactly. Yeah,
Um,
and that is one
okay.
example. Then the other very commonly you- um, um, promoted animal welfare practice is that of neutering. And I say this as somebody who was and is quite extensively involved in engaging such practices. So it comes from a space of self-reflection. It's not me sitting, on an armchair somewhere and criticizing what animal protection people do. Um, and neutering is, and if you have a dog, you must know, it's seen as the gold standard in animal welfare for all companion animals, dogs, cats, whatever it might be. But then if you actually think a little more carefully about it, neutering is at the end of the day, it is quite profoundly biologically harmful, physiologically harmful to the individual animal, because it's castration in males and ovarian hysterectomies in females. They're quite serious surgeries with long-term permanent impacts. But if you at that point in time, I started looking for research in veterinary science on some of the negative impacts of neutering, and I could hardly find anything. It looks like research studies were not asking that question. All the studies that I could find were only about the positive impacts of neutering, which included things like they won't get pyelometra because they won't have a uterus, or they might be protected from some kinds of cancers. And obviously, it makes
And with males, it's often the idea of regression, reduced aggression, and
exactly.
somehow like this absolutely changes the type of personality the doggo might be expected to have.
Exactly. So there you see, right? So it's the docility. If it's a female, she won't come into heat. At which end of the day, it's it's if you have a dog in a human home or in some sort of human space, she will be bleeding everywhere. Many of them do, not all of them. Many of them do bleed, and which is obviously doesn't fit within certain standards of our health and hygiene and cleanliness. So you find that again, what is actually a practice of animal control becomes a practice of animal welfare, and because of these logics of care that are used, and neutering over time has people neuter these days in the name of dog or animal welfare itself, as opposed to animal control, and because of these sort of internalization of norms. And I suppose your dog is neutered as well.
Yeah, I mean, so he came from the Humane Society. We adopted him just over a year ago now. And if you adopt a dog, there is no option here. There is no determining whether you would like your dog to have that as an experience in their life. If you would like to, if you think you've got a different view on aggression or whatever it is, if you want to adopt because you don't want to abide by breeding practices or engage in that market, or whatever your reasoning is behind it, you don't have that as an option. You yeah, your doggo will just come to you having undergone this procedure. And I actually had a conversation with one of my housemates about this just the other day, because on the one hand, yes, I understand that there are kind of population conflicts, I guess, that happen, or ideas about how human and dog populations should or can interact. And it kind of, I think the seat of this, at least in our city, is the idea that we have to do something for dogs. We can't just leave dogs be. If there are dogs on the street, something has to happen. So, neutering them is a way of trying to keep those numbers down, the population, as you were speaking, trying to keep dog populations down. But then even just the invasiveness of the type of procedure, and I don't know anything about this, but I know that at least with humans, there are options that are far less invasive than having a hysterectomy or having your balls removed. In effect, like you can have far less invasive operations where you might also decide later on that actually my doggo, maybe there is room for them having a companion or having a family of their own. And it just seems as though that's not even an option. Kind of, it is the most invasive, most categorical procedure is seen as the solution, which, yeah, once you start to look at it, it is a bit disconcerting. It is a bit
Yeah, and I
uncomfortable.
think that's tied to
Mm.
docility and changing dog
Mm.
personalities to make them more adapted to life within human society. So in India as well, while we have a central law which forbids the killing of free living dogs, it also says that where municipal authorities want to control dog populations, they have to neuter, and it's a very widespread animal welfare practice, something that like even I engage in, right? And that's prime because you have, you know, uh, puppy when you especially when you give dogs an adoption and if they end up having puppies, then the chance of finding those puppies good homes are, you know, it's next to impossible. And once they're born in a human home, it's not very easy for them to be a street dog again. So for all those reasons, it's something that I would insist on as well. And I, when one is handing over an animal to an adopter. Um, but what I was trying to think about there is that how is, even in purely thinking in terms of animal welfare, I can, how is it that neutering went from something which was a strategic decision, a less than perfect decision or practice, right? There where you're trying to make the best of an imperfect situation or of the existing status quo. From that, how did it move to becoming a gold standard in animal welfare? To the extent that it then spread from just dogs to cats as well. I don't know about Canada, but in the UK, you now have programs run by animal charities where they go to what they call feral cat colonies and catch them and neuter them and try to rehome the kittens and ensure that the adults are neutered and put back. And I'm like, even though cats have traditionally not been involved in the kind of conflict situations with human society that dogs have been. So, but you find that there's this like movement of ideas across.
So, okay, so bringing it back to biopolitics and some of what you were talking about with regards to like these changing narratives. So we kind of had a discourse, I guess, a way of talking about dogs and saying, okay, there's this population, we need to control them. They're dangerous because of rabies, or there's going to be conflicts or whatever it is. And that idea, the actual idea of why it is we're doing what we're doing, has undergone a fundamental change where it's not about saying we need to control them as much as it is saying, hey, this is good for the doggos. This will make them better doggos. They will be part of our societies. They will be able to function better. They will be able to fit within what we think are, I guess, the norms of our the way in which our society should operate. They will abide better, and this will be good for them. So is that kind of the overarching arch of how biopolitics is implicating
So that
not just street dogs in
so
general?
that part of it where the shift in narrative is where the whole question of norms comes in, and biopolitics, biopower operates through the internalization of norms. Like, to go back to the example of high heels, I internalize these norms about how high heels make me look better, make me look more confident, make me feel more powerful. So when I go for a job interview, I wear heels, even if I may not do so regularly, even though it's not good for me. In the case of animals and non-human life, what you have is those who act on behalf of them internalize these norms about say for example neutering or even euthanasia being an animal welfare practice, and then go and act harmfully on the very creatures that they are trying to care for. And so that is what it's the internalization of norms that is the core mechanism through which biopower operates, as opposed to sovereign power,
So,
which is top down.
when we speak here about the internalization of norms, so a lot of the previous season we spoke about animals and experience, and we were trying to kind of center, I think, animals as subjects, animals as beings that experience the world and have a distinct way of understanding their environments. Are animals also internalizing these norms, or is this just kind of is biopolitics just humans navigating amongst humans who are internalizing different ways that they think animals should be in cities? Or are animals themselves also internalizing
So
these
in my
norms?
work, I'm only focused on human internalization of norms because I don't think I have any way of finding out to what extent a dog or a cat has internalized human norms about what a good dog, cat, or cat life is. Um, in obviously, animals of all kinds adapt to human society. They learn very quickly what we expect of them, and sometimes they do try to live in ways that please us and act in ways that seem suitable to us. But whether that's internalization of norms or if it's them being strategic, I have no idea. So I would hesitate to comment on that.
Fair enough. It's a complex question, but I do enjoy thinking through it just because, yeah, it is an interesting question. How can we start to look at and appreciate animals, observe animals, and try to get a sense of the extent to which they do abide by norms, where they do make decisions? I'm sure you've seen now, maybe I shouldn't be presumptuous, the Elizabeth Lowe film that just came out, Stray, with following the street dogs in Istanbul. And I just thought it was really interesting to see how it seemed as though they had internalized a variety of norms about the urban space. They looked so she just follows the dogs around the city, one doggo in particular. And for me, there were fascinating moments where the dog would cross the street and would look to see if there were cars. Still pooped in the parks, which a lot of people found offensive, so not abiding by those norms. But there were other urban norms, I think, where the dog was starting to pay attention. There are cars, they could hurt me. I'm going to make sure I look before I cross. And yeah, there's a feminist rally happening, and the dog decides to engage in some sex during the feminist rally, which maybe goes against the norm of what that event was supposed to be about, or maybe it doesn't. I guess it depends what they were fighting for. But yeah, it's interesting to think through the possibility of how we might be able to watch what dogs are doing in the space and consider how they are internalizing the way in which the society operates.
I would hesitate. So and there, the two examples that you provided itself suggests to me that it's not the same kind of internalization of norms that at least I talk about when I'm talking about ideas of a good dog life or wearing high heels, because at the end of the cars are a very material threat to dogs, and it only makes sense that they learn how to avoid them. Whereas pooping in the park is at the end of the day a very human norm that a dog should not poop there, right? Whereas for a dog, that's very good pooping space because he or she probably has space to bury it and do whatever is right from a dog point of view, ecologically.
Yeah.
So
But then I guess the dog has internalized a dog norm,
yeah,
right? Which might be in conflict with
human
a
norm.
human norm. But maybe then I'm veering too far from what biopolitics is or could be about.
Yeah.
It's interesting to just think through. It's a challenging question for sure. What I really want to ask you about is how you use the word street dogs. So you use it quite differently. You think that there's a difference between street dogs, stray dogs, like you almost have a typology of different ways in which dogs could be categorized. Could you possibly tell us a little bit about that before we start wrapping up?
So stray is a very culturally specific term, and it's a way of classifying any animal in a way to denote it as an animal that is out of place, that doesn't belong somewhere. So you could have the same dog, and one system of classification could call it a stray dog. Another system of classification could call it a street dog. And free living dog is a term that I started to use because when you say street dog, you kind of you think of dogs as only being in places where there are streets, and that tends to be urban areas, whereas free living dogs are found everywhere, even in places where there are no streets, so to speak. The street dog is a term that's used in Indian law and very commonly used in India. But I expanded that to talk about, what is it that is different about these dogs to the way in which we normally think about dogs, and it's that they're living outside of human ownership, so they're free living, much like many other animals are. So they actually could all refer to the same dog. It all depends on the human viewer, the human classifier. So what to me is a free living dog could be a stray dog to you, and in Indian law could be a street dog. So it's not the dog in and of himself or herself, but rather
How we view the dog and
place in human
their
system.
belonging, I
Yeah,
guess, to some
yeah.
extent. Mhm. Fascinating. Great. Thank you so much. We're going to start wrapping up a bit now. And at the end of every show, I give guests an opportunity to read a quote that kind of tries to sum up some of what we've been talking about or something related to the season's theme. Do you have a quote ready?
Yes, and there are a couple of lines from the shorter essay that I sent to you, where it was a co-authored essay, but it kind of compresses some of these ideas about development and the relationship between biopolitics and development, and you know the place of conservation in today's world that I discuss in both the academic paper that I sent you and some of my other work. So I will read out the quote, and then perhaps you could ask me. I don't know how you normally take it from there, but I will just read out the two lines that I've chosen.
Yep. Let's see. Let's see how it goes. I look forward to hearing it.
So it is simpler to arrest poachers and exterminate invasive alien species or free living dogs than to effectively contest the developmental machine. However, the net outcome of such scapegoating is that conservationist attention is distracted from the root causes of biodiversity loss and large scale human induced harm to non human nature. So, those are the two lines that I picked for this.
We haven't even touched on development really. It was something that came up when you were speaking a little bit about your personal experience. And here, I think, again, developments and kind of the idea of biodiversity are used often to manage animals' lives. What do you think? How do you think development is used to manage animals' lives? And does it operate does it operate differently in different cities? Do you think that the idea of development is used in all cities to manage animals' lives, or is this just something that's found in specific cities?
So, but the earlier conversations that we were having about a good dog life and about how neutering and euthanasia become animal welfare. How did they go from animal control to animal welfare? Even though we didn't talk about it in terms of development, ultimately it's this broader vision of a certain kind of a good human life that is driving these these practices of animal control as well as these ideas of animal welfare, right? So we think that our cities should not have stray dogs because we don't want to be exposed to the risks and nuisances that they can pose because of a certain vision of development that we have. And here I'm using development in its broadest, most basic sense. I'm not talking about one particular development project. I'm not talking about one style of development, whether it's capitalist or socialist, but overall this and broader project of shoring up human life so as to kind of reach a certain kind of vision of a good human life, which is something that involves insulation from the risks posed by living as a part of nature. If you look at pretty much everything that is done in the name of development, it is to protect humankind from being animal, from being a part of nature. Right from the houses that we live in, the clothes we wear, the food systems that we are a part of, the medical systems, that healthcare systems we are a part of, even the current war against SARS-CoV-2, it's all about insulation.
So we've got like this ideal type of what it means to be a good human, and a lot of what it means to be a good human has us divorced from all sorts of other species unless that species is under our control. So a good human might have a dog, but it'll be a doggo on a leash in a very controlled, ordered, clean environment. We've So our idea of what a good human is quite sterile. Actually, it's quite divorced from any sort of messiness or um, and I think most of us would never achieve that ideal. Most of us come into contact with all sorts of messiness every day, uh, but I suppose that doesn't stop us trying to create policies. We view it as, I guess, a normative ideal that we're trying to move towards. If how can we get cleaner? How can we get more organized, more and oftentimes I think we end up looking at biological processes or other animals that we've how can we yeah, it's a really weird thing when you
Yeah,
look at it
yeah.
because life is messy.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
not a good human, because a good human can mean it, whether you're a good person or a bad person, but a good human life, right? So and that includes even like all of us, even those of us who try to think critically about it. We are quite embedded in what is a comfortable life or a good life, in those ideas that we
Yeah.
we in ways that we are perhaps not fully aware of. We participate in the healthcare system, for example. We benefit from it. Now, the thing about the pursuit of development is that it involves harm, right? The pursuit of human well-being of this kind involves harm to others, whether they be non-human others or human others. Human others, there's a vast literature on displacement caused by development of all kinds, right? Whether it be infrastructure projects or economic development, or in the case of COVID, the lockdowns in different parts of the world, they caused immense livelihood displacement, and in places like India, even death, not because of COVID, but because of the measures that were put into place for COVID. And in obviously, and the destruction to non-human life caused by development, I don't have to kind of explain to you. I mean, we all know it's come back to bite us in the backside, so to speak. Um, so, right, what was I going to say? So development in and of itself is fundamentally biopolitical, because you have these extremely harmful practices, which practices that might be harmful to others currently, but in the long run are harmful to us, but which are justified and actively, like they have a very active force in today's world because of these narratives of progress and improvement and well-being. So it's fundamentally a biopolitical pursuit. Uh,
Yeah, and I see now kind of why earlier on you said harm is really central to a biopolitical understanding. But I think my inclination right now when you speak about harm is how do I remove the harm, right? Is there any getting away from harm, or is harm just in trying to understand biopolitics and trying to understand development, is it not so much a matter of saying, okay, how do we reduce harm, or is it a matter of just acknowledging that there is harm? How does or is there no call to action here? Yeah, like, because as soon as you mention harm, people think negative, and then they want to fix that negative. Is that what the goal is here?
So I definitely use harm in a negative sense in my work, right? And here I'm talking about harm done to others, but and harm done to others in an effort to protect ourselves from harm. So I think there are different ways of. So there's this extremely inequitable distribution of goods and bads of of harms and benefits in the way in which development is practiced and in multiple areas, right? So healthcare, for example, harms non-human others and also lesser what we people from socioeconomically marginalized communities in the service of protecting more privileged communities, human communities from harms posed by disease. Right? So there's
So it's also looking at, so it's not so much that we can get away from harm, but that harm has been concentrated on specific
yeah.
populations, whereas other populations have kind of managed to, in pursuit of them having a better life, they've managed to sidestep a lot of these harms. So yeah, like you said, an unequal distribution of harms and benefits. It's okay.
What I'm talking about in that quote is the conflict between biodiversity conservation and wildlife conservation and many kinds of animals that you often see, whether they be invasive alien species or animals like free-living dogs and cats, birds and cats, for example, dogs and wildlife, and invasive alien species and other what are called native organisms. They're all very commonly seen conservation conflicts where conservation, which is a space of care, goes about actively harming different non-human organisms because they see them as threats to other more valued ecologies and animals. And so in that essay and in also the paper that I shared with you, um, some of what I'm trying to think through is to what extent it is that these animals are the ones that are actually threatening valued biodiversity, or is it that they're just easier scapegoats because what is actually changing landscapes and threatening all kinds of non-human organisms is this developmental machine and at all levels and at all kinds. But then it's very difficult to challenge the developmental machine because we are also quite deeply embedded in it. And so therefore,
Yeah.
other organisms become easier targets, whether they be gray squirrels or street dogs or I don't know what.
I think that kind of the idea of development being this monolithic, singular progression is altering the lives of humans and animals in cities in quite profound ways, and we only really get a glimpse of it when we start to, I think, compare cities, as what you've done with some of your work across the UK and India, but also when we start to compare across time and how cities have changed.
It also pits
Mm.
some non-human organisms against others, or some human communities against others. The conservation example, right? You protect red squirrels, but then you exterminate gray squirrels. You protect a particular kind of, you know, I don't know, but yeah, invasive species is another example. Where you eradicate some um, organic plants in order to protect other plants, even though the actual threat is habitat loss caused by development or landscape change caused by different kinds of human activities. And so, what some of this work tries to kind of do is to point out that by focusing on these easy scapegoats, whether it be poachers or street dogs or invasive species, uh, first of all, you're never going to be able to really actually address the problem because even if you exterminate an invasive, what you think of as an invasive species, as long as the broader landscape doesn't change, the animal that you actually want to protect is not going to come back because the landscape has changed and therefore it's no longer hospitable to that organism. And that's the reason why the invasive species has been able to take hold there anyway. They're adaptive creatures, the ones that have been able to adapt, whereas the ones that you want to protect as native have not managed to survive these human-induced changes. So as long as conservationist attention remains focused on these scapegoats, the broader changes that one might want to see in terms of the flourishing of non-human life is probably likely never to happen because the root causes of destruction are not being um, addressed.
I spoke to Paula Kari, and she was kind of raising also. It's interesting that you spoke about this tension between different species as well, because there's a lot of talk now about reanimating cities and making cities more, more animal to some extent. But the animals that are included in those narratives have to kind of fit within the idea of what humans want from animals and what could conceivably sit within our idea of development. And there's very little conversation happening about, like you said, invasive species and animals where things are not as seamless. What about the animals with whom we already have in our cities and we're actively trying to destroy because they don't fit again with this idea of development, with this idea of a modern city, and I think, yeah, that's a big project. How do we start to just unpack? Do you have any ideas how we start to unpack and grapple with challenging these
So,
development
yeah,
discourses?
which is like, that. So, if we were thinking along conservationist lines, for example, some of what I've been arguing is that we need to learn to, instead of expecting rural communities elsewhere to live with wolves or bears or elephants, we need to first, those of us who are in cities, need to first learn to live with rats and cockroaches and dogs and gray squirrels, right? And that at the end of the day, the risks cockroaches and rats and mosquitoes pose to us are probably far less than wolves and elephants might pose to rural communities elsewhere. But you will find that the very same people who actively, promote or support elephant conservation or wolf reintroduction or tiger conservation are also very likely to be uh, not open to sharing their own spaces, living spaces, everyday living spaces with less risky creatures, less noxious creatures, which they consider noxious. So, and I guess that is where the change needs to come, and that is a very kind of practical way of rethinking development and reapproaching development is by learning to live with what you might consider risky or noxious, and instead of expecting others to do it.
Yeah, it's yeah. I was going to use a bad. I always get my metaphors mixed up. I was going to use clean up your own house, but clean doesn't quite seem to be what we need right now. Maybe be okay with the messy parts of your own house and start to consider that sometimes other organisms and other animals and other beings are part of our landscape. And yeah, I guess, how do we start to build policy and how do we start to think about our cities not in this kind of sterile way, and like you said, to not project where the change needs to happen onto others constantly. Great. Well, thank you again so much for this conversation, and I will share the papers you shared with me. We've spoken, I think, about three of your different papers. I will include them in the show notes so that folks who are interested in reading more about your work, they're great. I read all three of them yesterday, and I really loved the cartoon. I actually shared it on Twitter. There's just this great cartoon you have of the topology of dogs showing like different ways in which animals are is the word typologized? I don't know. Categorized. There we go.
Yeah.
And yeah, I just, the doggo pointing up to, wanting to be extinct. We fall into this category
Make
that they want to
extinct.
make
Yeah.
extinct, which uh, it's a great quote. Um, so thank you again so much. If you could possibly tell us a bit about what you're working on.
Yeah.
You said you're currently doing research right now, right?
Yes, I'm here for a project on farmed animals in India. And India has the world's largest farmed animal sector, but hardly any kind of conversation around the implications for ecologies and the lives of the animals themselves, except for some animal protection work. So I'm here trying to understand what is it that's really happening on the ground. In what way are these conversations happening or not happening? If they're not happening, why not? So that is what I'm here doing. I have a larger pan-India project on street dogs and rabies and public health starting in September, where we're trying to use the we call it a decolonial approach to public health and street dogs, where instead of approaching health concerns associated with dogs from a Eurocentric perspective, where street dogs or stray dogs are seen as primary vectors of disease. We want to draw on some of our previous work, where we look at the whole multidimensional relationships that free living dogs have with people, where they contribute in not just in negative ways to human health. They don't pose just health risks, but they also contribute in positive ways to human life and human health, in order to um, really understand what is the relationship between public health and free living dogs. So that's the next project that's coming up, and I'm also doing some work on urban nature, yeah, but beyond street dogs.
You're so busy, so busy. Well, I'm really excited to see and read some of what's coming up, and I might reach out to you again to have you on in a future season where perhaps we look at conservation or at health, because it's been great talking to you today. If people want to reach out to you and get in touch, where might they find you?
So my university webpage has, I could send you the link, has a lot of information. I tweet at KRITCRIT, and email is perhaps the best way of reaching me, k.srinivasan@ed.ac.uk. So those are different ways in
Awesome,
which
wonderful. I'll make sure that it's included in the show notes too. Well, thank you so much for joining me today, and apologies again for being slightly distracted. But it's been wonderful talking to you, and I hope that the heat doesn't get you down too much. I hope it's cooling off a little bit now. Does the temperature go down a bit in the
yeah,
evenings,
yeah,
or
I'm
does it kind
sweating
of just
less
stay up
already.
the whole day?
I'm sweating less already now that the sun is setting. Yeah. Yeah. And don't apologize for being distracted, because we were just talking about how life should be messy, right? So,
Exactly, because this is life with other animals, and
yeah,
sometimes
yeah.
things don't go as neatly as.
Including the ambient sounds from here, whether it's the children playing outside or the birds talking. So let that be in if you can pull it off.
Fantastic. Well, thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. It was very easy talking to you. So thanks.
Welcome to the Animal Tone Highlight. In this one, I decided to focus on a dog who's already come up several times in season 3 and is bound to come up many more times before the season is done. And that is, of course, the urban dog. So, as you know, these highlights are relatively new, and I'm still figuring out how best to carry them out. If you've got any ideas, please feel free to send me a message. But for now, I really enjoyed what I did last week in reading an excerpt from a book, and I thought I would do the same thing today. I wanted to highlight a book for you that's called On Looking by Alexandra Horowitz, and she walks around with experts who help her to see the block that she lives on with new eyes. And she has a chapter in that book where she decides that one of the experts she needs to go on a walk with is, of course, her dog, Finnegan, because he has an incredible sense of smell and will help her to not only see her block differently, but understand how her block smells. And she writes, biologically, the human nose works in the same way as the dog's. Odors are swept into the far reaches of the nose and land in receptors, a few million of them. But that is hundreds of millions fewer than the dog bears. The difference in number of cells translates into a difference of kind. Dogs detect odors at 1 or 2 parts per trillion, unimaginably more sensitive than we are. 1 part mustard, 1 trillion parts hot dog. Dogs can detect the mustard. To begin to understand what a city block really smells like, there seemed to be one clear course of action: ask a dog. So it happened that one day I set to taking a walk around the block for this book with Finnegan, the earnest, playful black dog in our home now. She later writes, Finn pushed out into the fresh air with enthusiasm. I followed him. Then we stopped. It had occurred to me to ask his preference in our walking route. So instead of pulling him left, parkward, or right, cityward, when we exited the building, I stopped on the steps. Finn, ever cooperative, stopped as well. He perched on the top step, projecting his snout proudly ahead of him. As a steady, light stream of people walked by, they pushed air out of the way as they passed, occasioning plenty of sniffing by Finn. She later goes on to write how Finn determined their walk and how straight lines along sidewalks were not really the way Finn wanted to walk, and that his walk was very much determined by the smell of the city, and things that looked ordinary and everyday to her, like a hydrant or a bench, were in fact really interesting to Finn for a variety of reasons, noting how Finn's nose helped him to both see into the past and into the future. Later on, she writes, minor clashes between my dog's preferences as to where and how a walk should proceed, and my own indicated that I was experiencing almost an entirely different block than my dog. I was paying so little attention to most of what was right before us that I had become a sleepwalker on the sidewalk. What I saw and attended to was exactly what I expected to see. What my dog showed me was that my attention invited along attention's companion, inattention to everything else. If you haven't heard of this book before, I greatly encourage you to check it out and read it. It really is just a fantastic read, and you'll find that your walks around your own city are kind of illuminated in a new and fascinating way. Before I let you go, here are a handful of interesting tidbits about dogs that you might not know, such as dogs are considered to be the first animal that humans domesticated, roughly 15,000 years ago. It's currently estimated that there are around 900 million dogs in the world, and interestingly, only 20% of those are thought to be dogs that live in human homes. Most of them are free-range or free-roaming dogs, with the largest population of dogs currently living in India. If you're interested in watching some cool and interesting videos about urban dogs and some of the ways in which free-living urban dogs might live their lives, definitely check out videos on Moscow's urban dogs. I've added some videos to the animal highlights on the YouTube channel. These are dogs in Moscow that have figured out how to use the subway system. So they hop on and hop off the subway when they want to. They know which stops are really good for access to food. They've devised a whole range of tactics that are useful in begging for food and getting food from passers-by. They sleep on the subway, and they've got really interesting social networks. And if that interests you and you'd like to learn and see and watch more about free-living dogs, definitely check out Elizabeth Lowe's film Stray, where she follows dogs around Istanbul, noting how they live their lives and the variety of both human and dog connections they make. Thank you once again to Krithika Srinivasan for being a fantastic guest, to Animals in Philosophy, Politics, Law and Ethics A.P.P.L.E for sponsoring this podcast, to Jeremy John for the logo, and Gordon Clark for the bed music. This is The Animal Turn with me, Claudia Herzenfelder.
For more great iRaw podcasts, visit irawpod.com. That's IROARPOD.com.